Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelou, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. The Transparency Task Force is a certified social enterprise, which means we exist with the intention of making an impact as opposed to making profit. We're international. We have about 4,000 members around the world now, roughly 3,000 in the UK, the rest across Europe, North America, Australia, the Far East, and some in South Africa and India too. So that's the Transparency Task Force. Our strategy about driving change in the financial industry is to create all kinds of opportunities to bring good thought leadership about reform to the surface. And one of the ways we do that is through our book club meetings, where we provide authors with a chance to talk about the philosophy behind their book, the motivation for writing it. And I'm extremely pleased that today we have a session all about integral impact investment, written by Robert Dellner, who is a very well established and remarkably supportive member of the Transparency Task Force community. We'll be getting to Robert quite shortly, but first of all, I'm going to invite each of our attendees to briefly introduce themselves and also to explain why the topic of impact investing, responsible investing, sustainable investing, why that topic generally is of interest to them. And I'm going to go to Stefan first, because I know this is a topic that really, really matters to him. So Stefan, you're first in. Who are you? Where are you? And why is this topic of interest to you, sir? Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. My name is Stefan Pagacek, and I'm the co-founder of Future for Impact. We're a technology company, but I like to say that we're more than that. We're a company that provides an immersive, integrated journey through impact and sustainability. And the goal of our platform is to create these impact and sustainable outcomes that companies and investors can use to incorporate into their business models, their investment strategies, their portfolios, wherever they're trying to understand how much sustainability and whether or not that sustainability is making a significant impact, both from a financial and non-financial view. And I'm very happy and honored to say that Robert's integrated impact investment thesis, which you will hear during his talk, underlines our entire platform. It's the underpinning of how we are going to evaluate and produce these outcomes, how we're going to look at each of our clients' impact and sustainable goals, and how they're currently measuring it using, tools like SASB or Sustainalytics or MSCI or TrueCost or any of the different impact and sustainable benchmarks that are out there. This is my own personal feeling, but I feel that Robert has captured from an integrated process and thesis, and this is why we reconstructed Future 4 around his integrated thesis, is that you have to meet the user where they are. You have to understand what they know and what they don't know about impact and sustainability. And then you have to bring them along on this journey. And that's what we do. So we're really excited. We have several projects that we're developing that are going to help us build a platform. And, my feeling about impact and sustainable investing is not about the present day. It's about what we can do for the future and ensuring that we have a healthy and sustainable future to live into. So.
And fantastic, Stefan. You've really got us off to a superb start. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed listening to every word of that. Wonderful.
Oh, thank you, Andy.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. And tell everybody where you are, please, just briefly.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I'm calling in from Boston, Massachusetts.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Let's go from Stefan to Michaela. Michaela, briefly, please tell us about yourself and your interest in this particular topic. Thank you.
Hi. Hello, everyone. So I still have to decide what I'll be when I grow up. I went a bit and I looked at Robert's background, and I see he also has several streams of occupational streams. I am physics, math, PhD. Actually, I went to Boston, Massachusetts, MIT. And so I did teach college physics, math. Then I did finance. I worked as a risk manager. I am very interested by everything, even psychology. And so I'm here because I'm curious to see what's going on, what everybody else is doing. And somehow maybe I'll get some flash of inspiration. And I'll let you know.
Fantastic. Very, very good. Thank you, Michaela. We'll now go to Mr. Ian Neal, who, like Stefan and Michaela, is also a very active member of our community. Ian, lovely to have you with us. Please introduce yourself and tell us where you are. And just before you start, Michaela, tell everybody where you are as well.
Oh, right now I'm in Toronto.
Okay.
Yeah,
Toronto. Thank you very much, Michaela. Mr. Ian Neal.
Okay, I'm Ian Neal. I'm in Scotland. For the past 30 odd years, my company has been providing the UK pensions industry with a pensions technical service, making sense of the legislation, hence behind me. But I started out in life as an ecologist, completely unrelated.
I didn't know that, Ian. I've known you all these years and I did not know that's where you came from. I didn't know that.
Very few people do. I don't talk about my past history. But through that, I think I developed an interest in systems thinking and a strong preference for holistic thinking. And I think that was why I was drawn to this particular notice. I've not participated, as Andy knows, in a previous book club meeting. I've tended to be too busy. I bought the book. It hasn't arrived yet. And I say straight out that I don't know much about investment. But for 40 or 50 years, I've been active in Friends of the Earth and Global Justice Now, and a lot of movements which are very much concerned with sustainability at a global level.
Thank you very much, Ian. Wow, there's a whole new side to you that I didn't even know was there. That's wonderful, Ian. Really good to know. You mentioned systems thinking, and whenever I hear the word systems thinking, I immediately think about Mr. Martin Rich. He's going to be the next person to introduce himself. Martin, tell everybody a bit about you, where you are, what you do, and why this topic is of importance to you as well. Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, Andy. Evening all. Good to see some familiar faces and some new ones. So I'm just north of London in the Hertfordshire countryside. I'm an ex-investment banker. So my career started in finance. I was a structural engineer at university, so I became a financial engineer. I spent 13 years in the derivative world, and then I spent 7 years in the impact investment space. I sort of got fed up with the mainstream finance and I wanted to do something a bit better. So I took those skills and started working for social finance in the UK, early social impact bonds, all of that good stuff, which was fabulous and a lot of fun, selling those investments and structuring them, but realized through that journey just how fundamentally broken the whole system is, but how fundamentally broken the investment system is. And how the usage of capital around the world is continuing to finance us heading down the cavern of climate change, of social injustice and everything else. And whilst the recent upsurge of interest in ESG and impact and all the rest of it is a positive in the sense that people seem to be more interested in the impact of their capital on the world, most of it is rubbish. Most of it is not having any positive impact. And actually a huge number of the things that have been set up to help us just are not taking us in the right direction at all. I want to change the system. That's why I set up Future Fit Foundation 7 years ago. We work with companies, global companies, SMEs, to help show them how to live within the planetary boundaries and societal boundaries. What does it mean to be a truly regenerative business? And therefore, what does it mean for investors to invest in those businesses? So like Ian, I haven't been to a book club before, but the moment I saw that somebody had written a book, challenging the whole system and coming up with thoughts and ideas. I thought that is one I must go and hear because I'm always interested to hear the views of others in the space. So really looking forward to it.
Martin, great, so great to have you with us. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And let's now go to Helen, then we'll go to Kim, then to Jean. Helen.
Hi everyone. I'm also new to this book club, so this is going to be an interesting experience. I'm a policy and government affairs professional, primarily focusing on retail financial services. But some years ago, I was working at the Money Advice Service leading the national strategy on financial capability. And it was through that I started to interact with people and learn about impact investing, amongst other issues, and developed a very strong personal interest. I think there's a really powerful potential in impact investing. I can see that there's growing interest in issues around ESG investing. So when I saw the title of this book and book club, it sparked my curiosity to find out more from an expert. Helen. And I'm in Enfield in North London.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. That's crystal clear. I love that. Thank you very much indeed. Let's now go to Kim.
Hi, Andy. Hi, Robert. I got out of my meeting early, so decided I could jump on, and really happy to be here. Kim Schweitzer, founding Time for Change London, still working on the premise of Time for Change London, but I was on a great LBS webinar today about taking that concept of impact investing, ESG, and linking it to executive compensation, short-term incentives and long-term incentives. So that's my background is executive compensation. So it was very interesting because a lot of discussion around, you know, what Martin said, and Robert, what you're going to say in terms of, is it working?
Thank you, Kim. And where exactly are you?
Oh, sorry, I'm in London.
You're in London. Thank you very much, Kim. And last but by no means least, we now go to Jean Hayden. Thank you, Jean.
Hi everyone. I've joined a little bit late, so I've missed the other introductions. I'm quite interested. I think when someone spent a lifetime trying to put together their thoughts in a book, it's quite a challenge. So I'm here just all ears, want to learn a little bit about investing, and certainly with regards to sustainable and sort of eco the way forward. So I'm just all ears tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you. What a lovely group we've got here. What a really lovely group of human beings who have an interest in such an important topic. And from my point of view, when I think about this issue, I am genuinely concerned. Martin expressed some real concerns about we're kind of heading in the wrong direction. And that's kind of the way I feel as well. I'm genuinely worried. I'm 57, so you know the medium to long-term impact of this going in the wrong direction isn't going to be that significant in the rest of my lifetime, I don't think. But I've got children. Hopefully one day they may have children, and taking anything like a medium to long-term view, I genuinely think there's a lot to be concerned about. And for me, the idea of approaching the world of investing and the capital markets with the hope or the aspiration or the intention that somehow it becomes a force for good. My goodness me, does the world need that? So when I got to know about Robert and his book, I thought, you know, this is definitely something that's very, very relevant for the TTF community. So Robert, thank you so much, not only for whatever you're about to say tonight, whatever you're about to talk about in relation to the book, but also for your warmth and your supportiveness. I think of you as a massive ally within the TTF community, and I'm so proud to have a chance to give you the opportunity to tell everybody about your thoughts as reflected in the book. Robert, over to you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and thanks everyone for their introductions. It's great to hear you all. I think it's worth taking a little bit of a historical and background journey, only because I hope you will then see how the book came about. And the book is not the end, it's the beginning, right? It's basically one step in a relatively long process. But let me go back to where I came from and why I came to write particularly this book. So as you can hear, I'm not English. I'm originally from Scandinavia. But I was sort of brought up in a family with those kind of egalitarian equality values. And at the time, quite a high level of kind of social awareness and understanding of fairness and the such like as a cultural phenomenon when I grew up. And I came to London in the sort of early 80s, mid 80s, studied economics in Sweden, came here, studied business, and then studied finance at LBS and so forth, joined the investment banking industry at a relatively young age, sort of 1986-7. Had a variety of jobs within BNP Paribas, which is now BNP Paribas Fortis, and later Citigroup. So, as another speaker said, you know, being in investment banking is a bit of a tough choice in some respects, because particularly if you're not feeling totally aligned with the culture within those organizations, it's quite a difficult journey. And I can kind of attest to that. But I made it sort of to the executive committee level at what was then Fortis Bank, then became BNP Paribas Fortis. And then decided to go and study psychology. It became quite obvious to me, this is sort of 2005-06, that in terms of banking and the industry itself, there was something fundamentally wrong. But there was something fundamentally wrong with the culture, mainly in these organizations. And I sort of, most of my colleagues were not very happy campers within that industry. I sort of then peeled off 2010-11, having spent a couple of years trying to talk to the industry itself and to banks executives about how do you change culture in banking? How do you actually work with culture tactically and strategically, cognitively, to make those kind of changes? And as you'll see in my book, it is sort of the core tenet, I would say, through it is about change. But I then went and worked as a clinical psychotherapist for a couple of years in the NHS, only to sort of reintegrate myself back into finance as the CCO at a firm called Assets Capital, some of you are familiar with. And then in 2015, it dawned on me that I really need to now genuinely start to integrate psychology, finance, economics, and the other sort of social sciences, anthropology and so forth that I've been sort of looking at. And I enrolled in 2015 on a PhD program run by Transform in Geneva and Da Vinci Institute in integral development. And I started my PhD with a thesis on integral accounting. I spent 2 years looking at measurement systems and how do we create protocol and accounting systems for this type of integral work that we're looking to find out more about. It then dawned on me that actually before accounting, of course, investments take place. So I decided to sort of go back and look at integral impact as the up and coming integral or the up and coming integral impact framework, which then I could build on. And I mentioned both of those words because impact, as we know, has been around for now 15, 20 years as a concept. It's really taken off, as some have already alluded to, in the wrong direction potentially. We'll come back to that. But also that the world has kind of started what we call an integral age. It's starting to look at things now much more systemically, much more holistically. And in that sense, you know, people like Ken Wilber from the US have been important philosophers and catalysts for the impact methodologies to develop further. But my methodology that I'm basing it on is by two gentlemen, Ronnie Lessman and Alexander Schiffer. I'll come to that a little bit later on, but it is a four worlds approach, but has psychology embedded into the dynamic. Because as a psychologist, it also is very clear to me that to generate change sustainably and in a healthy way, that is a sort of psychodynamic process by an individual, leadership team, an organization, and so forth. And that's kind of how also culture is then recreated or regenerated in some shape or form. It's a psychodynamic process. So background to the book was really that when some of you will be familiar with, when you write a thesis for a PhD, it's not the most eclectic form of reading material. So on my program, we actually have to convert the thesis at some point later on in the process into some form of book. So the book is kind of an outcome, which then hopefully can explain a little bit more succinctly what the actual thesis was about. And also another difference with sort of the integral PhD was that we actually bring it into the world. We also have to create a community. We bring it into the world. It can't just sit in a library somewhere. It has to be activated in that sense. So that is a core tenet of this particular form of PhD. And so I sort of started the book about 4 years ago as an outcome. And as some of you will be familiar with, of course, you don't write a book because you want to write a book. There's something much deeper, effectively, that you need to try and tell the world and tell by yourself, from yourself, into your industry community. So the book itself is not something I once sort of sits, or at least I didn't sit and went, oh, I'm going to write this book now. It kind of organically came about as a way of expressing, communicating in a way, what is the next step? So how I see at least the next step of impact investing. And having looked at this, of course, there's sort of, I would say, 3 tenets in the book. But before we go there, I just want to sort of take you into, let's say, the core 3 segments of the book is really around change. And the first one is changing yourself. And really that goes back to a fundamental psychological principle that, before you can change anyone else, you have to actually start working with how you see the world yourself and the change dynamics around that. The second one is, changing the investment organization, because again, as an investment organization, we're a reflection of our own thinking. And of course, our own thinking creates our investment thesis, which then attracts or repels our investees. And they then become a reflection of our own thesis, which is why the next one is changing the firms in which we invest. And the 4th chapter is called The Way Forward. That is the shortest chapter. And it's very much designed that way because it's kind of co-created. So once, for those who have read the book or will read the book, you'll see that it's a journey really of discovery of the self, of the organization. And it's kind of a symbiotic relationship then with how we create the map-making exercise, which then becomes the integral format for impact investing. So I've gone into some, I have my own approach, which is in the book, but I'm not saying that's the right one for anyone else for that matter. It's just one way of doing it. So the key tenets really for me are that every investment is impact. And you'll remember just the other day, that comment was also being made, and I'm not trying to simplify things. Definitions are very useful. Right? They create containers and signposts for what something means, which can then generate common understanding and re-representation. That's absolutely crucial and why they are so important. However, because they are in containers, they also have their limitations. So for me, when you look at impact investment at some form of thematic, which is perfectly fine. So let's say, for example, renewable energy is an impact investing. But one of the comments, which is a very familiar comment that came up on Tuesday, was that if you're an impact investor, you forego some return, or there's some sort of some sort of diversion into, you're moving towards philanthropy. And of course, given people's fiduciary responsibility to their investors themselves and mandates, that is very difficult then to sort of move into that space. So, but if you turn the lens around and you say, well, instead of coming from us into impact investing to what I think is actually real impact, and that is saying, what is it that we're impacting? Well, we're becoming very aware, of course, of the environment. We're becoming very aware of the social dynamics that we see around the world right now, South Africa just being the latest example, etc. So if we turn the lens around from what is actually being impacted and look at what we are doing to understand what is being impacted, you quite quickly, I think, come to see that actually all investments, or let's say at least most investments, are actually impact investments. And then the simple definition is that if you deploy capital in a form that has an impact in the E, the S, and the G, and what I would refer to as the C for culture, and of course finance and economics, which we all know well and love, then you have a more integrated and full impact in the world. And wouldn't it be responsible as stewards of capital to understand actually what we are impacting from the impacted perspective rather than the impact perspective, the thematic perspective? And that's kind of all I'm saying, is that, you know, we need to think about that particular aspect of it. And I use then the idea that if everything is impact, where do we go from here? That's sort of what I think is important to understand. So we have to go beyond these definitions to evolve and renew and regenerate impact, which currently is, it's kind of in a flat land. You know, we're stuck in methods, we're stuck in numbers, and as we also heard on Tuesday, we're stuck on data. And there's nothing wrong with data. We have to explore data to the absolute fullest that we can, but then what? So in terms of understanding nature, and you know, we mentioned ecology earlier, doesn't run on data. So we have to go deeper. We have to look at other aspects of understanding what is being impacted, and how would what is being impacted want to be measured, want to be understood, want to be accounted for, and taken back, so regenerated in that sense, and not destroyed potentially by, or at least diminished in some form by the capital which is being deployed, which in turn, of course, extracts a financial return. So that's kind of a sort of a meta theme. And that, of course, then also relates to what we call our burning issues. And I'm kind of agnostic to people's opinion about what's happening with the environment and the social issues and culture and so forth. On one level, of course, I have my own views. But what I was trying to do here is to say, if we are going to build a map-making machine, then we have to look at everything. And my burning issues can be different to yours. So I dial up and down within these worlds, as we call them, the four worlds of integral, differently to maybe what you would do. So we come back to this psychological aspect that when we look in the mirror, what do we see? When we look in our impact model, what do we see? What comes back to us as feedback loops? Data is one area, but what else comes back to inform us or understanding what is it actually what we have impacted? So that's another sort of third tenet that runs through, I like to think, that the whole book as an essence. I sort of start off talking a little bit about what we can call new economic paradigms. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there because I'd also like to have some discussion later on. But you can see that this approach challenges also the economic paradigm, the neoclassical economic paradigm that we're familiar with. And we're working on something within my integral community, which we now call the neo-associative economy, which is a much more relational economy, reciprocal economy in that sense, moving on from Rudolf Steiner, as it happens, who had associative economic frameworks. So we're looking into that. So what would an integral economy look like? And by the way, there is a book called Integral Economics as well that is written by my colleagues. So we start where we always are. So when you look in the mirror, you have to start where you are. So I always start with ESG. That's where the industry is, or SRI, or any of the other kind of modalities that we have in the industry itself. But then I challenge the status quo. You always have to go, so now what? You know, where do we go from here? Because in essence, impact challenges our moral core. So for those of you who know the framework, and I'll put the summary of the book and everything else in the book website, I'll give you the link later on. But essentially what we have different to Wilbur is that we have the four worlds, so going from south to east to north to west. And by the way, I'm not going to use slides here because this is sort of information you can look up later on. But the point is that the indifference is that in the middle of those four worlds, we have what we call the moral core. That's the touchstone on which all the worlds are being made into meaning and made to work for us through our moral core. So we're no longer just looking at legalities on this. And as Andy knows, I'm at my martial arts retreat this week. So I'm just showered from our last practice, but I was having a conversation this morning with one of my colleagues who recently retired from one of the world's largest consumer chemical product manufacturers. And we had this similar conversation. He said, yeah, we did a supply chain review in terms of cost benefit analysis and all the classic ways of looking at that. And we said, wouldn't it be a good idea if we also looked at child labor, what chemicals do they recycle, and so forth and so forth. So we went into ESG territory. And their legal department came straight down and said, absolutely not. Because that potentially creates a legal responsibility to do something. So here you have the juxtaposition between moving into ESG very gingerly for most institutions, but not wanting to see what's in the mirror. So for me, the core element of having the moral core as kind of the touchstone is so that we need to move beyond legal, regulatory, minimum requirements. We need to move into what is the moral standards that we need to hold institutions to account for. And I fully understand that if you're working for a pensions company, for example, this is going to sound very esoteric. That's not going to happen for a long time. It will happen, but not for a long time. These institutions are very slow. They're very linear. And there is a chapter in the book called The Digitization of Our Hearts and Minds, which is where finance kind of comes from. We have this enormous investment in the linear, rational, pragmatic forms of thinking, and we have become extremely good at leveraging that thinking. So more data, more information, more accounting, etc. But we're quite poor in solving problems through systems approaches where the solution is somewhere else. The solution is not going to appear in more historical data. It will not happen that way. It can only happen through a much more deeper, broader, and in my world, integral dialectic, which obviously brings us into governance and other important issues in terms of how do we work with these information flows inside organizations. So essentially, it's really to move numbers and data beyond numbers and data. And I sort of do some examples of that. So what are the alternatives? Well, one which we're very familiar with, of course, is calibration methodologies. So we all know that most of management accounting, and I'm an accountant as a background, is around relationships between numbers, which creates a calibration. One is higher or lower than the other. And we use them all the time. So calibrating is one area which we can go beyond. So using more of that methodology, I'll come maybe back to that a bit later on. But it's an inner journey to express outer impact outcomes. And without the inner journey, and I mean now organizationally as well, seriously, it's not going to happen. We're going to remain in flatland for another decade or two. And again, as I said, if you believe in the environmental forecasts for where we're heading, that is not fast enough. So we can't hide, I would argue, behind the mirror and not have a moral core, at least which we start to dialogue with in terms of what we are doing and how we're doing the deployment of capital. And we heard again on Tuesday, of course, returns drive everything. That's the fiduciary responsibility for most pension funds, for example. Fully understand that. So what I normally try and work with for an organization is if you are going to look at develop ESG beyond ESG itself, do that then internally. Do it what we could call under the hood, as a developmental process inside your own organization. Look at the impacts in a different way. So what do I mean by different way? Well, we need to talk about different methodologies. And there is a chapter on that, of course, in the book, where we talk about, the empirical world, which is, we know extremely well and fantastic, the rational world and so forth. But we also forget that in this, what we would call the South, where we have nature and relationship in our social structures and communities, that's, for example, where we could use something which we call phenomenology. It's very, very true and tested form of understanding. And we also forget that phenomenology was actually that gave rise to a lot of the science numbers that we now take as empirical. If we didn't have a von Humboldt, for example, we wouldn't have geography, we haven't had seismology, we wouldn't have, the way we look at weather maps and all the things we take for granted now, road signs and so forth. That was not from Humboldt, obviously, but I'm saying the way we now take for granted the symbols of re-representation of phenomena in the world, and we then reinterpret that back to us. And accounting is one form of it. We have many examples where phenomenology was used initially and then it became empirical. So accounting in itself, for those who recall, was actually an attempt to create harmony with the numbers. So Luca Pacioli, who worked with Da Vinci back in the 15th century, wrote a book called Divina Proporzionale, the Aritmetica de Matematica. So essentially, accounting was an attempt to create a divine proportion in firms and organizations in terms of how capital and money flowed between these units. And in a way, we have to now go back to that mode of thinking. What does harmony look like in accounting terms if we now introduce impact into the equation? Because integrally, we are alleviating imbalances where they occur from an accounting perspective. So for me, we go from double accounting to triple accounting because each of the worlds have balance sheets. And now we go into the middle core, which is then the final rebalancing, calibration between whether we have surpluses or deficits within these worlds. So in finance and economics, we can have a massive surplus, but where does it come from? Can we create integral returns as well within environment, within our social structures, et cetera, et cetera? That's kind of part of the later journey within that particular book for each firm to kind of get that methodology for themselves so they have their own mirrors. And that is also about knowledge creation. I'll speak a little bit about that. But essentially, we are on a map-making journey. The maps that we have are not good enough. They're not going to take us to where we want to be, in my humble opinion. I also think that firms have a fiduciary responsibility to go beyond financial accounting and the current levels of ESG and impact accounting, as good as they are, GIIN and so forth, IRIS and SASB, etc., are phenomenal. But I would argue that most investment firms, particularly large ones, have the resources, have a fiduciary responsibility to go beyond that, to really create value from values attached to impact. So you not only value values, but you have values for value. So turning these lenses around are important to understand how we can actually re-represent the outcomes, the impact outcomes, back into a way which we can share, which is what numbers are. Numbers are abstractions. They're a re-representation of some phenomena in the world that has happened somehow. We take them back in, and many people, myself included, very often believe they're real somehow. They're not. They're a re-representation. It's a translation between something out there back into the organization, but we deal with them very often empirically. Sadly, they're very often, they're actually not empirical in that kind of sense. So these are areas which needs explored by an organization and by the industry as a whole. And that's kind of the challenge, which I kind of try to take people on that sort of journey, because when you're making maps, you are, let's take an example. You're all familiar with the famous saying, there are many roads that lead to Rome. But I sort of half jokingly say sometimes, well, there may be, but if you want to get there, pick one. At least go on the journey. But when you pick a journey, it's no longer actually about the outcome. It's what you see on the way, what you pick up, the phenomenon, right, that you can actually take on board and experience on that journey. And now you can write or create your own map from that experience. And this is also, as we know, a psychological phenomenon, that we all experience the world differently depending on our paradigms, etc., how we were brought up, how we were educated, what we think is important in the world, and so forth, what our purpose is and our identities and so forth. So in the book, there's quite a lot of that kind of technology to take you through as an individual, but as an organization as well, and build the maps around what is it that we want to see for our impact, what I now call impact investment outcomes, integral investment outcomes. What is the map that we want to follow here? Let's not just follow someone else's map. Let's also, in addition, add our own to it. That's really important, because now you get into a dialectic. What is this about? What values do we want to imbue our money with? How are we going to attract clients going forward if returns, as may be predicted, are going to be much lower going forward? Because the economic extraction sort of machine is kind of in question now by many. So these are kind of important areas. So how do we add value to our clients that invest with us? Well, my opinion, one of the big differentiators is how we deal with impact, because the world, the next generation in particular, will value impact, the values within impact that you as an organization are able to communicate to them higher than today. I think that's a given. So that means now that you have to understand this, you have to become multidisciplinary. You have to move, as I said, from empirical only and rational to phenomenology, look at that in hermeneutics, so using other forms of understanding what is it actually that you're impacting. So there's a whole section about that, of course, in the book. But that leads now to governance. So, and some of you, I think, are interested in this particular topic. So particularly within ESG, governance to me is kind of separate, because culturally, governance drives the E, or at least the intentionality around the E and the S. And that is kind of how meaning making for the organization is created. So that creates understanding, re-representations. The power complex comes into governance. What do I mean by that? I mean, who has the loudest voice, the biggest voice, who has the most carry in those kind of investment committees or within boards, etc. And we often see that being played out, not necessarily overtly, but covertly or tacitly. But that creates our worlds. So if we can't change the way we have our governance system, the quality of the dialectic. So, as you know, David Bohm wrote a book on dialectic and talks very often about the implicit and the explicit knowledge creation, where both of them gets fused. And if you're only looking at explicit knowledge, so data, etc., you'll never get there. It will be very difficult to move a culture in an organization on in that sense. So the governance system, to me, is really where it starts. If you are going to look in the mirror, look there. Look at the way you govern, you manage capital, the kind of conversations you have. What is so one of the drivers, for example, for creativity, as we all know, is emancipation, is freedom. It's having the freedom culturally to say, what about this? Like my colleague here this morning said, what about going and looking at ESG elements in our supply chain? Having that confidence to do that and the openness to do so. So the dialectic is kind of where it starts. And some of you will be familiar with, in the beginning, there was the word. The word is the ultimate symbolization of how we operationalize impact in our organizations. So it's absolutely critical to look at how governance is managed and taken account for. So this comes back to natural systems. Natural systems, they self-organize, they collaborate, they operate independently. Is that present? So what we're trying to do here also, we're trying to replicate what actually happens more in living systems, in nature, than we are through the sort of empirical power structures that we very often see in organizations. Organizational structures, by the way, as you know, were based on the military initially. And today we have much more creative. You have enterprise values, which are way beyond balance sheets, much more creative value. How do we actually nurture and manage that kind of knowledge and capital in a classical hierarchy? Many organizations have left that now. We have holacracy. We have much more collaborative, co-creative forms, natural forms of working. So this is all, work in progress in many organizations. So I'll kind of stop there for now. But if Andy, if you can kindly also put in the chat for me I did create a website for the book. It's www.robertdellner.com, and you have some downloads, videos, and some other bits and bobs. But as I said, thank you for listening. But this is not about the book. This is what we do, all of us collectively going forward. So thank you.
Robert, thank you very, very much indeed. That was a very thoughtful and detailed explanation of what the book's all about. I really enjoyed listening to that. What we're going to do, Robert, if it's okay, is just invite each of the guests, each of the attendees at this book club session, just to share their thoughts in reflection to what you said. I'm going to go to Martin first of all, if I may, because I think Martin may well be able to pick up on some of the thoughts and ideas and some of the sort of systemic content around what you've been talking about. Martin, what are your thoughts in relation to what Robert has been saying? Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Fascinating. Thank you, Robert. Really found that very thought-provoking. First comment is, I've been saying for years, and the reason I set up Future Fit was that every investment is an impact investment. We just don't understand what the impact is. So welcome, friend and fellow traveler. I'm completely on the same page with you as that. And it's lovely to hear somebody else having come to that same conclusion. I guess there's so many things I could say, and I don't want to overuse my 90 seconds. I think what I'll focus on is the behavioral change piece. I think is the biggest challenge that we've actually got now. We created a roadmap over the last 7 years to show people how to live within the planetary boundaries. We've taken that and we've got people, big companies, small companies using it around the world, but nothing like enough. We have investors who are looking through our framework to understand their ESG risks and opportunities, which is fantastic, but nothing like enough. And I think I've come to realize that we really don't have much of a hope of turning the Titanic away from the iceberg. We are not moving anything like quickly enough. CEOs would rather have a quick badge and a round of applause on a stage than actually address the fundamental issues of needing to radically transform how they do business. I think the way forward is to create a global community of businesses who are showing how the world can be different, whilst recognizing that we're all operating within the system, and hope somehow that we can make that user group big enough that when the inevitable does happen, enough people can move across and say, actually, we like what they're doing, we want to be part of that, and hope that there's enough of society and the planet left for us to move forward, which is a rather depressing conclusion to have come toward, but it's about the best I can do at the moment. So I guess the question I would just leave open and pose to the group and to you, Robert, is how do we get as many people in those lifeboats as we can, so that when the Titanic does go down, there are enough people trying to join us in those lifeboats, and those lifeboats are big enough that we can take enough people forward with us.
Wow, that's really powerful stuff, Martin. And what's worrying me is knowing how much you know about these things. If you're worried, then I'm really justified in being pretty worried as well. Crikey. Are you basically finding, Martin, that the incentives, if that's, it's not quite the right word, but the incentives, the powers, the forces at work, the vested interests are simply so strong in maintaining the status quo? It's like trying to move through treacle. It's like really difficult. There's like huge inertia, huge resistance, huge pushback from the system itself. Every part of the system is fighting back, saying no. What really matters to me is, there was a phrase somebody used in one of our events this week. I think it was something like, we are jeopardizing, it was a powerful phrase, let me get it right. We are jeopardizing the future of the next generation for the sake of next quarter's figures. That's essentially what they were saying. And to me, that's really powerful. And it really kind of brings into stark relief this kind of tension between what's good and necessary and equals successful, flourishing future, and this short-termist predisposition towards focusing on everything to do with GDP growth and all the things that we spent lifetimes becoming conditioned to think matter when they actually don't.
Let's take a very, very quick example. Carbon Tracker put out a great report recently looking at the potential affordable energy capacity of just solar and wind distributed around the world using technology that's available today and economically viable.
Right.
It's an order of magnitude more in terawatt hours per year than we currently use globally. Okay, so there's 10 times as much available energy economically, et cetera, available to us right now that we know how to harvest. We could cut greenhouse gas emissions overnight for power if we made that transition. And okay, yes, I know there's energy involved in the transition, but you know what I'm saying, right? We could have a massive impact straight away globally on climate change, probably the biggest singular impact we could have that we know how to do. That data is available on the internet. You can download the report right now. So why are we not doing it?
Yeah.
Why are we not doing it? We can do it. Everybody stands up. Oh, woe is me, says Boris Johnson. I'm going to hug a bunny and I'm worried about climate change. Everybody's saying net zero. It's bullshit. Sorry for my language, but it is, because we know what the solution looks like, but we won't do it. Why? Because unlike the pandemic, we don't think it's killing us every single day. It is, but we don't see it, or we won't embrace it. We won't accept it. Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, MBS in Saudi Arabia, they're not going to change their business models tomorrow and their geopolitical influence tomorrow to allow us to move to a widely distributed, fully available energy system. but we know how to do it, and we could do it, but we're not doing it. So you're right, Andy. It's that inertia in the system that is stopping us doing it.
Powerful stuff. Thank you so much, Martin. Let's go to Stefan. What are your thoughts, sir?
Well, I'm very lucky because I get to live Robert's book every day in Growing Future 4. But I wanted to pick up on what Martin was saying, and it I think really comes down to the economic and business model. So for instance, when I tried to do a project back in 2007 to convert from fossil fuel to wind and solar for an industrial park, which was decaying, it was rapidly decaying, it was becoming an environmental hazard. The private equity firm that owned the park just simply said, we're not going to do it because Eversource, which was the utility provider, wasn't going to play ball because it's not in the interest of their business model. And it would require upgrades to the grid and investments that simply they didn't want to make, and at the core of all of this is laziness. It's just simply laziness, it's just as far as we can put this off and push this off and push this off into a future and just cross our fingers and hope that, it's going to turn around. Well, that's not happening. And all you have to do is look at the western part of the United States, which is burning to the ground, which is rapidly losing water resources to the point where we're going to have a civil war in this country between farmers and residents over how much water will be available. It's coming. It is absolutely coming because we are not addressing climate change with what Martin just described. And look, General Motors had the blueprints for electrification of vehicles back in 1980. They knew how to build an electric car back in 1980. Why didn't they do it? Because they were in bed with the oil companies. And as long as those incestuous relationships exist and we are driven by the dollar instead of what we should be looking at as our personal moral compass, as the moral compass organizations should adopt, not just for making a profit, but for looking at it from a community perspective, a regional perspective. How are we acting? How are we behaving? And one of the fundamental influences that Robert's work has had on me personally in terms of Growing Future for Impact is writing a corporate manifesto that if I showed it to corporate America today, I'd be laughed out of every boardroom. But I don't care because I want to build a different kind of company. I want to build a different kind of company and be that leader in that space. So I'm in complete agreement with what Martin is saying. And I just want I want to encourage everybody on the call today to read Robert's book with the idea of adopting these principles for yourself personally, and then seeing how you can take these principles into the world. And they can be inside your organization. If you sit on a board, they can be, from a board level. It doesn't really matter, but they can be ported into these different situations. Thank you, Andy.
That's fascinating and wonderful. And bravo to you, Stefan, for taking the stand you're taking with your organization. I think that's absolutely wonderful. But I'm going to share with you a point that you've just triggered off in my mind here. You know how everyone talks about statement of investment principles, yeah? I think in the pension space we call it SIPs, like the belief paradigm you have that you base your investment decisions on. Listening to you talk just now, Stefan, and listening to Robert talking earlier, it seems to me like before we build our statement of investment principles, what we need beneath that is another layer, which is a statement of our moral principles. Yeah, we need that statement of mindset, of our morality. The idea, and I've never ever thought of this before, but Robert articulated this, I thought so well. The idea that we need to kind of think about who we are and what matters to us as individuals. What is our mindset? What is our morality? What are our values? We need to have those kind of conversations with ourselves individually and societally before we can then go articulating whatever we think our investment principles ought to be. It's almost like saying to somebody, It's almost like expecting somebody to make a good meal without first thinking about the importance of getting the right ingredients together. The very kind of building blocks that define what you're doing as being worthwhile or otherwise, that bit of thinking seems to be missing. So this idea of understanding yourself before you invest is really quite profound. And that doesn't happen anywhere. There's no kind of, to my knowledge, there's no real kind of financial planning process or investment consulting process where you do a fact find to actually really understand the wisdom that the investor is trying to achieve, the moral mindset that they're trying to achieve. I don't know if I've really explained any of that really well, but I feel there's a whole new part to investing that I was really kind of blind to before. Thank you very much, Stefan and Martin. You've both made extremely powerful points.
Can I just say on that point, Andy,
yeah.
It's like saying I'm reading Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations,
right,
before I've read Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Got it. Absolutely.
We knew this back in the mid-1700s, for goodness sake. And everybody went forward and said, you know what, we're going to throw moral sentiments out of the door as a modern society, but we're going to carry on with the Wealth of Nations.
Yeah. I absolutely get that. People much brighter than me have made this kind of point before. They talk about, the free hand of the market being completely free to do everything, but that's not really what he was saying at all, was it? He was saying that before that, there's a whole piece around, basically doing the right thing. Fascinating. Let's go to Mr. Ian Neal. Always looking forward to what Ian has to say. What are your thoughts, please, sir?
Well, as I said, I know very little about investment. I've detected that impact investment with 2 capital I's is a thing, and it has a particular term, and it's almost a fashion in some quarters. But I completely understand that every investment by definition has an impact, and it's almost a truism to say that. But what interests me particularly is the growing realization that a fundamental human weakness is our tendency towards bipolar thinking, black and white, either or, cause and effect. So if we make a particular investment, it's expected to have a particular effect. But one of the lessons, and I mentioned ecology earlier, one of the lessons that anybody learns from ecology is that systems are very complex, and even a relatively simple ecosystem like a salt lake has quite a number of interacting components which the human mind is not geared up to properly understand. Robert will be familiar with a very influential psychological paper from 1956 by George Miller. He titled it The Magical Number 7, plus or minus 2. And it was a reference to the maximum number of things that a human mind can entertain at once. So I think we need much more sophisticated thinking. We need much more multifactorial analysis and tools to assist us in making rational predictions about the impact that our investments will have.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian. And let's now go to Jean Hayden. I appreciate a lot of this won't be your day-to-day bread and butter, but what is your heart telling you? Let me put the question to you like this: what is your heart telling you about what's been discussed today?
It's not my day-to-day bread and butter. If I can just say that because I've come into this sphere of finance and etc. through the pension scam aspect, and so I've learned a lot of the detrimental effect when money has been invested and investments have been lost, and the fallout from that. And then the other side is all the positive things that come about through people's life savings and investments, and then people really wanting to be to put that money to good use. While if with regards to pensions, obviously it's that is the fund that looks after you when you can no longer work. So that's where I come from. But My day to day, I'm in Manchester and Liverpool a lot, but Manchester, for example, it's a huge building site. There's so many apartments going up, buy to let, invest, and a lot of this investment, I believe, is coming from other countries, from overseas, maybe China, Singapore. And every day when I'm at the traffic lights and I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, people want to invest. It's sold as, you know, it's a good investment, and why not? Forgetting about scams or anything like that, but you think, okay, I'm going to make this, and this is, and these buildings are going up from someone who's not very well educated in economics and finance and that. You just see this, but my concern is we're outsourcing the people who can afford to live in those apartments. They're getting pushed out of the area. They can't afford to rent these properties because the level of rental, for example, is higher, because it needs to create wealth for the investors. So kind of understand that, but where is it leading us? And tying in, I think, where is that? What are we building? We're pushing, the city's going up. I understand that, great. But what is happening around the periphery is people are getting pushed out.
Yeah.
People are moving in, and how that affects society and the integration of people who come and work there. A lot of it's tied with university, so there's an awful lot of investments for university, come here, study, etc., etc. And I think the last year of the pandemic, we've realised just how interconnected we are, and how somebody doing something who's on less wages, minimum pay, how it can all be gone because of something that you have no control over. But I like to think we can, looking forward, have control, feel empowered, and think more. There's an awful lot with the TTF that it's amazing, the work, and I keep saying it, of trying to prevent the damaging effects of the wrong kind of people we're allowing in the system. But we want, on the other side, there's an awful lot of good, and I think we might be setting the foundations, people like Robert, people like yourself, and people who can make these changes in companies to say, you know, let's just step back and think about the future. Yeah. There's a lot of, you know, when you start getting into like government policies, socio-economic, philanthropy, philosophy, it can get really overwhelming. So I can only take it little bit by bit, but anyway. So hopefully we'll do something right with regards to. I think people want to do the right thing. We want a little bit of security. We want to make investments that will be really good for the next generation. As you say, we're not getting any younger, so fingers crossed we'll all be part of that change, even if it's in a little way or a big way. But yeah, that's why I'm here to learn, really.
Thank you, Jean. And you take your little bits very, very well, and you move forward very, very well indeed. Thank you. Let's check in with Helen. Helen, what would you like to say? And then we'll go to Michaela and then to Kim. Thank you.
My reflection on all of this is, I mean, I studied economics at university, and I found it really abstract and boring. But I've since discovered and become fascinated by behavioural economics and behavioural science, because I think it's a much more realistic and useful way of looking at and understanding and changing the world, because ultimately everything that happens in the world is the result of a combination of people's behaviours, right? So, you know, that is the big challenge in all of this, is how do you change behaviour? And, you know, we've talked a lot about all of the vested interests, conflicts of interest, and all of the biases in human behaviour. But ultimately, if you're going to change behaviour, you've got to, I think, accept and understand and work with the realities of human behaviour, human psychology, and all of the things that influence people's behaviour, and find ways to make better behaviours easy, you know, almost the default, because, you know, we've recognised we are quite simple human beings. We don't tend to really engage with the complexities of the world. You know, we understand investing in property because we can see it and touch it, and we know what a property is. But any other kind of investing and thinking about the future, you know, genuinely we're not very good at as a species. So I think we have to focus on how we change behavior. I think in this kind of instance, you kind of have to start with a coalition of the willing, don't you? You know, build momentum through a coalition of the willing and hope that you can build enough engagement and evidence and use stories and examples to really show, you know, build wider engagement in what can be achieved and how much it matters. But ultimately you need, you know, strategic leadership to really do that. And I guess my ultimate question is, who's going to provide that leadership to really build that coalition of the willing and drive change? And I'm not sure I have much faith in our government or any international body doing that. So, you know, where do we look for that leadership?
Helen, thank you so much. This makes me wonder about you know, the way that we vote as individuals. And I'm not going to delve into people's politics, obviously, but I've my son spent 7 months in Norway in the Arctic Circle as a husky tour guide. So people went out there, you know, from all over the world, went to where he was working, and he was this tour guide. And myself and my wife went out to visit him, and he took us out on the most amazing tour into the absolute wilderness. This is north of the Arctic Circle, and I'll never forget one particular moment in time. There was just me, my wife, my son, and I think it was 8 huskies. And Daniel, my son, stopped us, and we were in the middle of nowhere. We were literally in the middle of nowhere, and I looked around, you know, 360 degrees. There was no sign whatsoever of mankind, nothing at all, only us, right? And it was kind of this strange silence, this sort of silence you just don't normally hear, right? And everywhere I looked, every 1 degree of that 360 degrees was absolutely beautiful and pristine. It was beautiful and pristine, and it was beautiful and pristine because it had no evidence of mankind anywhere, right? And I burst into tears, and I burst into tears not from a conscious place. There was something deep down inside. It was my soul was saying something. I could feel it. And I just burst into tears, the most kind of joyous, meaningful tears I've ever cried. And basically, I voted Green ever since, right? And this is not a pitch to become a Green voter. I'm not trying to persuade anyone's politics here. But I, in that moment, felt so connected with the pristine and immaculate nature of our planet that it genuinely, literally had a long-lasting, profound impact on me. So much so, right, that when I think about what really matters, I really don't think very much matters at all beyond looking after our planet. So that, to me, is why this topic is so incredibly important. Helen makes a brilliant point about leadership. You know, there was some news today in the UK about we should have a tax on sugar and salt because it's really bad for people. And then you get, and forgive me, I can't resist saying this, you get our Prime Minister basically sort of poo-pooing the idea because it's not going to have the right kind of economic consequences. These are the problems we've got. We have a democracy that is not truly reflective of what really matters. We have a democracy that's become kind of skewed and contaminated. So I ultimately think that this is a leadership issue. I think that left to our own devices, our species will quite happily crash into disaster if left to its own devices. And to stop that, we need powerful good forces in the form of good leaders to kind of make us do the right thing. I almost see it as like children, you know. You wouldn't let a bunch of kids do something stupid or dangerous. You would tell them off and you'd get them to do the right thing. And I think that currently society is behaving in a very reckless way, and our leaders are behaving in a very, very reckless way as well. It was good to get that off my chest. Let's go from Helen to Michaela. Michaela, your thoughts, please.
Well, I couldn't agree more with the tax on sugar and salt. And your government should know that then they would save on the healthcare costs.
Yeah.
So that's obvious. Unfortunately, there are lobbies probably from the industry because sugar and salt are very cheap. So instead of putting 300 grams of product, you put 270 and 30 grams of sugar. Here you are lowering the cost of the food. So that's the, sorry about that. So I thought I used all my words. You said I was in several meetings this week. So
No, it's okay.
get back to me. I had a budget of words. So, now about the laziness. Yeah, we can see it all the time. It's in recycling. I heard that in Sweden, I think there are 11 categories of recycling boxes, like, glass and paper. And anyway, we put them all in one place here in Canada. And it would cost so much just to, how can I say, to sort the recycling, that we just send it to the third world, or we burn it in secret. So that's what is done with it. And this is where the personal responsibility comes in. I see young people, you go to the shopping mall, they press on the button to open the doors, like it wouldn't, they don't think, well, it's electricity, right? And it's better even for your health just to use your muscle and push the door.
Yeah.
So that's what people are doing. Also about doing these things wrongly. Okay, we do the recycling. It's absolutely a delusion what we do here in Canada about recycling. And moreover, I would say it's very counterproductive because it calms us. We are reassured that we are doing the right thing, and we don't do so. Therefore, we don't take any other action because we did our duty. We did the recycling. Mm-hmm. And this is done with many things. So this is why we have to be extremely, how can I say, aware and thinking, and do not trust the, those feel good. I remember the film with the new corp. All of these corporate ads that are just feel good ads, yeah. Okay, which are so bad. For instance, BP, right? The flour, the BP. So here is the oil company convincing us that they are moving, at their own pace, under their own supervision. They decided that they did progress. So this is what I said, what we need also. We need some goal and we need some measurement. How do we measure progress? How do we know we moved in the right direction if we don't have a measurement? So I think that is what is needed in order to do progress. I think, and about Robert, you said at some point that everybody has their own moral core. Well, I think we need to have some common goals. Otherwise, if we don't push together in the same direction, how do we hope to get somewhere? Yeah. So I would say that is, and that would be whatever, our survival, our, okay, that's, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Michaela. Thank you very much, Steve. You always make very interesting points. Thank you. And let's go to Kim. Kim, what do you think?
Well, it's hard for me to put in words what this last week has meant, because obviously I'm an American over here in London as a transplant. And you know what? I would have loved for England to win that game on Sunday because of what it would have meant to the country. But what happened afterwards? And, we talk about leadership. We have no leadership for even, standing up to racism in this country. Let's take before the game. And then I cannot remember that stupid phrase that they were trying to use, Priti Patel, about why she did not support
gesture politics.
Thank you. Gesture politics. And I'm going to write that down because I thought it was the most ridiculous thing. But we can't even get what I would consider common decency out of our politicians. So I know, Robert, I'm always taking the negative side, but I'm not trying to take the negative side. I'm trying to figure out how we get to the positive side. So Robert, you talked about the moral core, and we all talk about the moral core. And, you know, we can sit here and do that, but there's certainly a lot of people who, if they heard this conversation, would be thinking we were on some sort of other planet somewhere having this conversation, because we have such systematic problems, the easiest systematic problems we can't even fix.
Wow.
So that's what I struggle with, is that, and again, obviously being from the US originally, we've got the whole Trump thing going on, and
Yeah.
that's not an easy issue to fix. I mean, that certainly is real every day, for people in the US. But, you know, how do we fix what we can fix and then broaden that out? And if we could, you know, take the entire population of the world and get everybody to agree to that moral core, then we'd be somewhere. But, you know, it's the baby steps that we need to take to at least try to influence the things we can change. This conversation we were having today, it was with LBS, and PwC was on there, and Harlan Zimmerman from Syrian Capital. And he was talking about, you know, from the clients that they work with in terms of the investments, they have now come out and mandated that ESG become part of their incentive programs, long-term / or short-term incentive programs. And, you know, the pushback that some of the panelists were having. So Tom Gosling, who retired from PwC, now working with LBS, and Philippa O'Connor was on there too. And, you know, just talking about, well, is that the right thing? How are we going to measure? A lot of concerns about bringing ESG measures into incentives and actually creating more pay and more wealth, because there's not a lot of great ways to measure, especially the S part. They were talking about the S and the G parts being difficult to measure, E's being, you know, easier to measure. But we have to start somewhere. And I think that was what, you know, Harlan's point was. We've got to start somewhere, because if we don't, you know, 25 years from now, are we going to look back and say, well, we should have? So it's a really interesting discussion, but certainly I think from a culture perspective, Robert's spot on. It goes back to the culture and back to the leaders driving the right culture to get to these behaviors.
Kim, thank you so much. You've really brought to the surface what's going through my mind right now. I've ended up concluding, and I'd be really fascinated to hear what Robert says to this. I've ended up concluding from this conversation today that the way that the world invests is symptomatic of the way that society is. I'm starting to see quite clearly in my mind this idea of, you know, here's the kind of the moral fabric of society, and the way that we invest is a function of that. You know, if the moral fabric of society was right, we would not invest in short-termist ways that harm the planet. So in actual fact, to get investment working properly, we need to get society to work properly, and that is oh my God, that's I mean, we all know what's wrong with society. I mean, this must explain why Martin feels the way Martin feels. I mean, bloody hell, we've got one enormous job on our hands. Wow. Robert, your thoughts, please, and take us to a close. Sum up for us, share with us your reflections on what's being said, and are there any particular points that have been made tonight that are causing you to think? Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Yeah, no, absolutely. There is a lot food for thought here. as someone said earlier, and I would totally agree, it's very difficult for individuals or for institutions to look themselves in the mirror. And I use that as a metaphor. Really, it's about understanding reality. People, organizations hide behind denial. Denial is a form of protection mechanism. But as we know, when we get into trouble, it's denial that is part of the problem. We need to go beyond denial. That's one important element of it. What I was trying to do is pretty much in line with what a few comments have been, which is that we just have to start where we're at, as always. And I don't think we have to convince, a large proportion of the world why we're going to be doing this, why we need to make these kind of changes. It's more about creating the map making tools which explains how we're going to be doing it. So I'm trying to position this book as an answer to how we're going to be doing it. But it's a beginning, it's a starting position, which then requires further co-creation, because it's you can't change everything in one go. And just to sort of explain where this book came from, the good news is that it's not 4 books, because I actually wrote over 300,000 words. Actually, it was 450,000 words initially. And then it was kind of, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. People won't understand it and so forth. So it was like, well, you got to do 2 books or 3 books. But it's been pared down, and we need to add to it. It's a beginning, and it's not, it's not a solution. We are the solution. Individually, the organizations are the solution. And culture and governance is at the core of it. And what is culture if not the collective beliefs and value systems of an organization as expressed in behavior? So behavioral economics come in and all those sort of things. That needs to be looked at. It's not one thing that needs to be changed. It's a systems approach. So we have to look at everything. So when we are on our journey to Rome, we build a map as we go along, because it's the map that tells us what we need to understand, what we need to pay attention to, what is within our awareness, so we can then take appropriate action within this governance system. And as someone put in the chat, of course, it's the board of directors, which needs to have these kind of conversations, begin to have the sort of conversations that we're sort of alluding to. So that to me would be where I'm happy to pick up this conversation with any of you privately. Please email me, robert.dellner@live.co.uk. If you have any thoughts, and very happy to have one-on-one conversations going forward.
Robert, thank you so much. Thank you so much. A lifetime's thinking into that book. You've shared the key thoughts about it tonight with all of us. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank everybody who's participated in tonight's session. It's actually, to my mind, been a really kind of deep and very, very meaningful session. And I think I'm going to think about the world of investment differently to however I've thought about it until now. That's, for me, it's been a pretty meaningful session. Can we please show our appreciation, not just to Robert, but to ourselves for taking the time to to be here and have this intelligent conversation amongst friends. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very, very much indeed. Well done. I wish you all a good rest of your evening or day wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much. See you next time.